Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk, Breaking the Silence, Talking Race and Equity with Children. My name is Teresa Pfister. I am a second-year doctoral student at the University of Virginia in the School of Education and Human Development. I am getting my doctorate in educational psychology, applied developmental science, and race, equity, children, three of the most important things in my life. And my family would joke, talking, also very important in my life. But I just want to tell you that I'm very grateful that you are here to listen to this talk. I hope that it's informative. I hope that it's helpful. I hope that you walk away feeling like you've gained something in your understanding of the topics, in the tools that you have, and I hope you feel empowered to start doing this work or to continue doing this work and thinking about it in maybe a new way. So let's go ahead and dive on in. So our roadmap, what we're going to cover over the next 30-ish minutes, I'm going to do an introduction to myself and my work. I think it's really important when particularly we're having conversations about race and equity to frame it, to let you know who I am, how I got into this work, why it's important to me, and what I'm bringing with me when I speak on these topics. Then we're going to spend some time just talking about why it's important. Why is it crucial? Why are we talking about race? Why are we talking about equity? And why are we talking to children? And I think that there is a lot of really good information in that part of the presentation for you to use and to think about when you're engaging in conversations with your colleagues, with your children, with the parents of your children, with people on Facebook, why it's important that we're having these conversations. And then my favorite part is the research-backed practices. So based on tons of research into these topics, I'm hopefully neatly synthesizing for you some ways to think about the work, some ways to do the work. And that's my hope for this presentation. So let's dive in with the introduction. So I always love the opportunity to share photos of my life. It's just it tells you who the person is and where they're coming from. So on the left, you can see my family. I have 5 brothers. One of them was not born quite yet in this picture, but I grew up in rural Wisconsin, low income, Catholic family, and lived in a community that was predominantly white. Very few families of color lived in my community. And so one of the things I will get into later is my explicit racial socialization was limited to non-existent. Most of my socialization was absorbed through media. So it was absorbed through TV shows and movies and books that I was reading. And I didn't realize that I was being racially socialized. We think, well, if there's no explicit socialization, it's not happening. False. It's happening, indeed. And so I learned that it was happening when I went away. I went to college. I was a Questbridge scholar, which means Questbridge is a nonprofit that helps elite colleges basically find high-achieving low-income students and recruit them. And so I got a full scholarship to go to Pomona College. This is actually our first retreat. I think it was my sophomore year. And Pomona has like this little house in the mountains. And so in the middle of winter, where there was actually snow in the mountains, in California, there's not usually snow. We went and we had this really beautiful retreat together and talked about what our mission was going to be, like what we could do. And it actually turned into a really beautiful mentoring program that still runs at Pomona to this day. But I bring this up and I share this picture not only because it's adorable, but because this is really the space, the group, the opportunity in which I realized that I had absorbed a lot of messages about race. I was not so much to the point where I had explicit racist views. I just had implicit beliefs about what it meant to be a Latinx male or a Black female. And it was through building relationships with my peers that I was bumped, that my my perceptions or my expectations were, they bumped into reality, and I bumped into my friends and they were like, but Megan is not this way, and Christian is not this way, and therefore these beliefs cannot be true. So that was really, I would say, the start of my journey in understanding not only did I have messages that were problematic, but that there are systems of inequality and systems of racism very much alive and well in this country. So upon graduating, I became a teacher. So I first went abroad, I taught in Ethiopia, but then I came back home and I taught 4th grade in Brooklyn, New York. You can see some of my babies. In this space, I was teaching math, I was teaching science, I was teaching history, but I would say what I taught more than anything was love and support and compassion, and really I learned more, I think, from the kids than they learned from me. I learned about their experiences living in a liberal city and still dealing with racism, and even as 4th graders dealing with it. Made me incredibly aware of like the fact that I could run to any liberal city and that we're still going to be dealing with these structures and these issues. So after I earned my master's in childhood education, I decided I wanted to look into college access because college for me was so transformative. I was like, you know what? I know that there's a college access issue in this country. I know that some people get in and some people don't, and there's a pattern, and so I want to participate. And so I started working as a college advisor for SEO scholars in New York. You can see this is my first class, the class of 2018. And through my 3 years of working with them, and actually technically 4, because I'm currently working with them part-time, you can really see in the barriers that my students face to get into college, that we as a nonprofit provided SAT tutoring, we provided coaching around their essays, we provided coaching around their lists, we provided connections to the colleges, we provided basically the ins that they needed to even be remotely competitive. It didn't matter that they had 4.0 or higher GPAs. It didn't matter that their SATs were super high. They needed these other connections. They needed these other supports in order to be competitive and get into college. And so that experience was on the front lines. It was really empowering. It was really beautiful. And I'm still very close to most of my children, but it was insanely frustrating because we were stuck. Like we were working within a system that was meant to keep our children out. In community psychology, we talk a lot about this metaphor in which you're down on a river and you see someone drowning. And so you jump into the river and you pull them out and you help them. And then 2 minutes later, you see someone else coming down the river drowning. And so you jump in again, you pull them out. And then you look and there's another and another and another. And I feel like that was the work in college access. And I know a lot of people feel that's the work in social work and in health services and all of these different areas that you're just dealing with, everyone's drowning. And so in community psychology, we talk about the systems, we talk about the structures. And so we walk up the river and we see that there's a broken bridge. We see that someone's pushing people into the water, right? We see that there is a larger problem at the root and we address that. So for me, I didn't even know this metaphor when I came to grad school, but I wanted to move up the river. I wanted to see if there was something we could do closer to the root of the cause, root of the problem. So it was very hard to leave my babies in New York, but it's time to go to grad school. Just like they left me to go to college, I told them I had to leave them to go to college. I'm able to still obviously keep in touch with them. It's been very gratifying and wonderful. DeWilka, this one in the red shirt, and also the black sweatshirt on this side, she just got a kitten. So yes, I'm still in touch with them. But I just wanted to say there are a lot of projects that I'm a part of, a lot of things that I've been studying since I came to school. It's hard for me to believe I've only been here for a year and a half. I've been doing a lot of work. So If you're interested in any of these topics, let me know, and I'm happy to talk more about them or share something about the preliminary results or what's happening. But one project I'm on is we're looking at high school experiences of Black girls, and particularly the socialization around race. So what are the messages they're getting from teachers, from peers, from parents, from the schools, like based on policies about their race and their identity? I'm also doing a project on sense of belonging and sense of safety in middle schools, depending on your identity. I'm also looking at empathy, compassion, respect, and integrity in middle schools, particularly how schools can facilitate that growth and the development of those skills. I'm working on a policy brief on the discipline gap. So the gap that we see between different race and ethnicity groups. How it's tied to the achievement gap, how it's tied to implicit bias, how it's tied to policies. It's been getting a lot of attention recently, particularly with the presence of place in schools, et cetera. I also have done a lot of work in implicit bias. So I've studied pretty extensively the neurobiological processes of implicit bias, the root of implicit bias. I'll talk a little bit more about it because I think it's really relevant to this work. And then I would say the overarching theme is what we're about to talk about, which is race and equity and what we can do about it, particularly me as a white woman. What is it that I can do with my positionality, with my education, to help work on this and to help make a more equitable world for our kids? So all those things to say, this is what I'm coming from, this is my lens, these are the things that are important to me. And if you're still here, we're now gonna kind of transition into the topic. So my first question actually stole from Dr. Beverly Tatum because I think this is a really powerful way to start these conversations. And it's to ask, what was your earliest race-related memory? I would add to that, and she adds to that, what are the emotions? Like, what did it feel like? And then did you or didn't you talk to an adult? So I'm gonna slowly sip my water and let you think about that just for a second. So what Beverly Tatum has found in her work and what I have found in my unofficial work of just asking all the people I know, the earliest race-related memories vary in how early they were. But regardless of how early they were early. They were very strongly emotional, usually very negative, and almost no one has talked to an adult about it at the time, right? And so I think that this is just a really important frame when we're thinking about why do we have to talk about this? Because race exists, racism exists, and if our first experiences, our first impactful, influential experience with race is embarrassing, is shameful, is painful, and we didn't have support of an adult, we're not set up to do this, right? We're not set up to do this well. And so I think of the experiences that we've had and the experiences that children have had, and I think we can do better. And I think that's a lot of what this talk is about, is how to do better and support our children who are having these transformative first experiences with race and working with them, working through it with them. So I originally had written the slides to say, why should we talk about race and equity? And I was like, it's not a question. So I just changed it to say why we should talk about race and equity as a statement. So racism exists. That is the most bare, solid, this is the way the world exists. This is the way our country exists. And I believe wholeheartedly with my intellect, with my heart, with my experiences, that racism exists and it is powerful in this country. I highly recommend, and I put a little tag at the bottom of this page, Project 1619. Anna Nicole Jones does a very good job in that project with all the different writers that she brought in and artists she brought in to really speak to how racism exists today. And it started, and she argues, it started in 1619 when the first ship of enslaved people arrived in the United States, arrived in Virginia, and how that institution has shaped the way our country looks today. And I think a lot of people have become aware of the way the police, the way we began policing in slavery era, but she talks through the medical system. She talks through the highways, the way that we like segregate cities, the way like all of this, they're able to tie to 1619, to the institution of slavery. So I think it's really, really important, and something that I learned when I was solidly an adult, not when I was younger, that racism exists on a structural, institutional level, not just interpersonally, not just on like social media, right? Like it's everywhere. And that's really important to know as a frame for what we're going to talk about. Children are not colorblind. So I think a lot of well-meaning parents and educators, adults, want to be colorblind and think that it is actually preferable to be colorblind to not acknowledge difference in race or ethnicity or cultural background. I fully disagree. That I think that is not actually a useful way to think about the world, and it contributes to erasure and not giving people what they need because we are different. But the point I really want to make with this slide is that children aren't colorblind. Children as young as 6 months notice the difference in eye shape, difference in skin color, difference in hair texture, and even have a racial preference. There was a study in 2017 that they were finding that children have racial preference at that age. So it's highly important for me just to like put it out there, I think, that being colorblind is not the answer. That does not deal with the issues of race that exist. If we lived in a perfect world where systemic racism was not a thing, then I think we could, like, color blindness would not be harmful. But in the world that we currently live in, it is harmful, and it is not something that I would suggest practicing or trying to encourage in children. You know this one. Children are sponges. They're absorbing everything through their bodies, through the spaces that they're in, their social interactions with their peers, with you, with their family, with their siblings, with their neighborhood. They are learning the rules of the world, okay? And if the rules of the world they are learning are racist, they're learning racist behaviors, they're learning racist beliefs, they're absorbing that information. Beverly Tatum refers to it as the smog of racism, that living in our society, you are always breathing in this smog, this through social media, through interactions, through the structures, through the way that things work, the ways that things were made to work. We're constantly getting these messages of racism, of a hierarchy of human beings. And so that leads me to say the next point, that these attitudes and beliefs, children are sponges, right? But attitudes and beliefs around race, a scholar found that they get cemented early. 9 years old is when they were finding that however the kid is feeling about race at that age, it's pretty consistent following them. That is not to say that there's nothing you can do after a child turns 9, right? That's not it at all. What I'm trying to point out is up to the age of 9, they are learning, they're open, it's not cemented. They're trying to figure out the rules of the world. They're trying to figure out what they're supposed to believe. And that's when we're working with them, right? Like we have so much opportunity and responsibility because we are with them at that age to make a difference. To also go back to the idea of 9 years, right? I don't want anyone to walk away thinking 9 years, like we have to get them before that, otherwise we're screwed. That's not true at all. And I think this previous summer is a really good example of that we can have a lot of adult human beings, right? People, even young people above the age of 9, who saw what happened this summer with Black Lives Matter, with the murders, and decided to change, decided to educate themselves, decided to learn about these topics. And so I want to point out that this 9 years old is not like, it's not like don't be hopeful anymore. 9 years old is just, they're learning so much at that time. We have a lot of opportunity at that time, but there is still transformation that can happen after that age. And we as educators, we have such an opportunity and such a responsibility. Our children spend more time with us sometimes in a day than they do at home with their siblings or their parents, right? Especially when I was teaching 4th grade, I spent more hours a day with my children than they did with their families. And so when they're learning, okay, what does the world look like? What are the rules? How am I supposed to think about other people? How am I supposed to think about race? How am I supposed to think about hair, right? They're absorbing that in our environments. And so while we can't control everywhere that they're getting their messages, and we can't control all the messages they're receiving, we do have a lot of say in our classroom about what values we hold. And so now, you already kind of got a preview, but research back practices, my favorite part, the best part, I would say. So we've got the frame, right? We know that this is important. We know that there are issues of race and equity, racism and equity in our country. And we know that children are learning how to be in the world. And so our work as educators is to figure out how to help them, right? How to help them, how to be, if we're thinking about Beverly Tatum's example, how to be that adult that helps them work through these feelings and works through these experiences with race. So it's empowering. So they feel equipped. So they feel like they have the vocabulary. So they feel like they can move forward. So without further ado, research back practices. Also, how cute are these kids? Like stock photos, but good stock photos. All right, number 1. Anything that we want to do with children, we have to be able to do with ourselves first, right? We cannot walk into a classroom expecting our children to be perfectly anti-racist if we are not doing the work ourselves, right? If we're not working on our own beliefs, if we're not working on our own education first. So that's why I say it begins with us. I think of these 3 steps, 1, 2, and 3, as easing you into the discomfort. So they're gonna get more uncomfortable as we go. So first one is learning about the lived experiences of people with different identities. This I think of as my reading fictional stories about people who have different lives and different identities than me. It's watching TV shows about people who live in different places and have different experiences, different family structures. It's kind of just seeing that it is possible and it is good and they're just different ways of being and different ways of living. And so I think that that's pretty like cool that you're like, yeah, I can do that, great. 2 gets a little harder. It's learning about our history and current systems of oppression and how they function. So this is reading Project 1619, right? It's watching documentaries like 13th. It's watching or listening to podcasts that talk about systemic oppression, that talk about the history of racism, that talk about experiences of racism. This is really digging into the structures of racism that function in our country. To give us context, to understand what people are experiencing. This is hard, this is uncomfortable. I know plenty of people who burn out at this, right? That it's terrifying to really realize what is happening and what has been happening. And it's, I think, very easy to feel completely overwhelmed and unequipped to kind of address it and to even think about it. But I also think that that's privilege to be able to be like, all right, I'm gonna put this down and walk away, right? And I have that privilege. Like I have the ability to start reading Project 1619 and go, whew, and put it down and walk away, right? Like I have that privilege. It is not my lived experience. And I think that that's something to not to feel guilty about, because I don't think that that's effective, but it's something to recognize that we do get to walk away, and that should remind us that like not everyone has that option, and therefore we shouldn't walk away. Like we should lean into it. Number 3 is identifying and addressing our own implicit bias. So I think implicit bias is a buzz term. I think that people use it differently and talk about it differently. I will say a few things about it. I will say first, everyone has it. Every single person. I don't care what your identity is. I don't care what your experiences are. Everyone has it. And the reason everyone has it is because they have a human brain. Okay? We are alive because our ancestors kept themselves alive, which means that they developed ways to avoid things that are dangerous, avoid things that are scary, to automatically make a decision that something's unsafe and go in the opposite direction, right? And so implicit bias has kind of developed as we are getting all this information, right? So we understand that there's a smog of racism. We live in a country that is systems of racism. We're getting that data, right? Our brain is absorbing, whether we're consciously or not absorbing it. It is getting into our brains and it is getting programmed, and we are learning what to be afraid of from that information, right? What to avoid, what to hate based on that information. And then we have an interaction or we have an opportunity, something happens and our implicit bias gets triggered and it says, oh, we should feel unsafe right now. This person is dangerous. And we react in that way, okay? This is called implicit bias because most of it for people is completely unconscious. They're not even aware that they're absorbing. They're not even aware that their brain is starting to process this way. They're not even aware when they get the message that they're unsafe necessarily, where it's coming from, why it happened. But one thing that I like to reiterate with implicit bias in particular is it's going to be really hard to undo all that programming. It is possible, but it is very hard. I think 1 and 2 actually work really well on digging out implicit bias, but I highly recommend being super aware and non-judgmental of any kind of like, I don't know if you would call it like a flare up of implicit bias, or just basically when it pops into your brain, like, oh, I should feel unsafe, or oh, this is a bad person, or oh, whatever. You are aware that that's what it is, that you label it. This is an implicit bias. And you take time to think through, where could that come from? And how can I reframe it? How can I reset this to believe that like, no, that's not actually true. But I would say also really importantly, that you stop between the feeling, like that your brain goes, oh, we should be afraid, and you feel afraid, and then acting. I want you to be able to like have a pause between the thought and feeling and the action. And I think that like, if we worry that we can't get rid of implicit bias, we can definitely control our actions. There's a lot of really good research about how rehearsing responses. So there were some teachers who felt that they were responding pretty aggressively to their Black and brown male students. And so they were like, I'm really struggling to get rid of the implicit bias, but rehearsing, so the next time the student doesn't do what I say, or the next time the student is like rude or whatever it is, I'm going to not react emotionally. I'm going to follow these steps and we're going to solve it this way. And they found that was incredibly effective for resetting like our behavior following our implicit bias being triggered. So implicit bias is a reality. Everyone has it, but we can learn to shift it, and we can learn to keep it from controlling our actions and our behaviors that would promote racism, right? So it begins with us, but we're with our kids now, right? So I'm gonna let you kind of read through these a little bit as I drink water, and then I will take you through them. Okay. Teacher throat is real, like even remotely, like I'm feeling it like the way I was in front of a classroom projecting my voice. So, okay, so be courageous. Step 1 is fighting selective inattention. So one of the researchers that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but it will be a resource that I can get to you, noticed that parents, educators, adults were selectively not paying attention to moments of racial tension, or moments where students had questions or students made statements. they didn't feel, and I would imagine this is true from my own experience, they didn't feel qualified and they didn't feel comfortable addressing it, and they worried about how it would turn out or whatever, so they just ignored it. I think it's really important to realize, like we were thinking in the beginning with Dr. Beverly Tatum, that so many initial experiences with race have so many really heavy emotions, and there is no adult to help the child navigate them. So I think selective inattention is one of the ways that we adults contribute to that pain. And so I say, you gotta fight it. You gotta lean in. So that's what these next steps are about. So utilize the small teaching moments. If things come up, if a student asks a question, right? Like if a student asks a question about why someone's skin looks the way that they does, or someone's hair looks different, or someone's dressed in a certain way, utilize that as a conversation, right? Like don't just let that live. Don't let that student feel confused. Don't let that other student feel put on the spot or ousted. You want to definitely use those opportunities to connect. Have the conversation, right? And know that it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable. And over time, that's the next point, is that this is a muscle, right? So over time, we're going to feel more efficacious. We're going to feel like, okay, I know how to have these conversations. I've had this conversation before. This is what went well. This is what didn't. And you can kind of reflect and think about how to do better next time. But I also want you to know you don't have to do it on your own. Your immediate network is a great source, right? So who's at your school? Who are your colleagues? Who's your coach? Who's your boss? But also, who are the experts who exist, right? There are plenty of experts, particularly now, that are getting a lot of attention because they're training people how to do this work, and they have advice on how to do this work, and it exists out there because you are not alone in this. And it's hard. It is not easy. We have to learn how to do it though, and there are people who are willing to help you. Okay, so I think that's the next part. So then this next slide is about, okay, so I said to lean in and have conversations, embrace the discomfort, right? Great in theory. What do you do? Like, what are your points? What are you saying? So what I wanted to kind of cover is based on what Beverly Tatum said. I'm leaning so hard on her. She's brilliant. Be factual and be empowering, okay? So first, tell children what is true. Do not lie to them, okay? Well-meaning educators, well-meaning authors of textbooks and other books lie about slavery. Tell children, because they don't think children can handle it, tell them that it wasn't that bad. Tell them that it was kind of like a job. Tell them that surely they didn't have to, they were able to stay with their families, right? That doesn't help a child. There's studies, there's a professor that I'm not gonna remember her name right off the top of my head at UPenn, who's studying in most recent years, books that have been written on slavery that are terrifying, and contributing to students when she interviews them saying, oh, slavery isn't that bad. Like, slavery wasn't that bad, it was a job, right? We're not helping children if we're lying about that, because then they have to unlearn that. Or maybe they don't unlearn that, and that's even worse, right? So we wanna be honest. We wanna tell students what's true. But we don't want to terrify them, right? We don't want them to feel like there's only bad in the world, there's only horror, there's only these horrible things, right? And so Beverly Tatum suggests focusing on the resistance, focusing on the leaders, focusing on the helpers, right? Give them someone that they can hold on to as a symbol of good, as a symbol of hope, right? As an example of who they could be, right? And that's going to lead to the last point, which I'll get to. The next point is give them space and time to feel and ask questions. Do not drop in and say, there was slavery, but there was also Harriet Tubman. Okay, bye. They're gonna have questions, and they should have questions, and we wanna be able to answer them as best we can, knowing that we don't have all the answers, right? We wanna be able to answer the questions. We wanna be able to give them space to feel. If they feel scared, if they feel sad, if they have questions like, is this gonna happen again? Or, like, these questions can come up, and they're hard questions. Like even just saying that question out loud, I was like, oh shoot, what would I say, right? So I think that it's really important that we are giving them that space. We're not abandoning them to feel these things by themselves. The last point I was saying is kind of coming from the hope piece, right? The examples of resistance, the examples of leaders. Students have a hard time, particularly our younger kids, are going to have a harder time conceptualizing systemic racism or systems of oppression. That's hard for adults sometimes, right? So we need to lean on what students understand, and students understand fairness. They understand what is fair and what is not fair. So providing them opportunities to address what is fair and not fair in their environment is actually incredibly empowering. And what you're contributing to is their sense of efficacy, right? So one of the studies that I'm working on is looking at civic efficacy in students. And so I'm looking at 4th grade students. But they do service learning about energy, and they have projects in which they're working in their community to reduce energy consumption, to teach people about where our energy comes from. And then we're seeing, like, does that make them feel more efficacious? Do they feel like they can make a difference? The answer is yes. They do, right? Like if they have opportunities where you're supporting them and helping them through the process, they're going to feel like they can do it. And if you continue to give them scaffolded opportunities to practice, they're going to feel more empowered. And when things get bigger, right, when they get older and problems get bigger and they start to understand larger systemic problems, my hope is that they then will be able to take this sense of efficacy and apply it, right? So, factual, empowering. Okay, my little face again. All right, so there was in the Harvey article, Harvey also wrote a book, but there's an article that I'm going to link where she's getting interviewed about her book. And it's about how to raise white children. And the main message that she said is that we need to teach our children to be good friends. Okay, so I'm going to let you read the 1 through 4, and then I'm going to talk through them a little bit. So first off, we're teaching our children that difference is good and that difference is beautiful, and there's not a hierarchy of how to be. Hair of a certain texture is not better than another hair of a different texture, right? Certain eye shapes are not better than others. Certain skin colors are not better than others. That we're embracing difference is beautiful and difference is good. I like to use the metaphor of ecosystems. We have to have variety and diversity in our ecosystems in order for them to function. They will collapse if we suddenly have all of one kind of fish or all of one kind of bird or all of one kind of anything. The entire system collapses. We need diversity. And so I think that that's an important first point when we're teaching our children to be good friends. Secondly, is thinking about friends, right? So everyone experiences the world differently, and empathy is a really, really great way to help students bridge difference, right? And different experiences and different perspectives on the world. And so Harvey used the example of her daughter feels safe with policemen. She thinks that that signals safety and security and problem solving. And she knows she can go to a policeman if she's having an issue. Her friends of color don't feel that way. They feel the opposite. They feel that police are a threat and that they need to avoid them and they need to act a certain way around them to be seen as a not threat, right, in order to stay safe. And so our work is to help cultivate empathy in our children so they understand that other people have these perspectives and that they're not wrong perspectives, right? They're different because of their identities, because of their experiences, because of their parents' experiences, and that empathy is really important to help be a good friend, right? Number 3 is to fight stereotypes, provide and explore counter narratives. So stereotypes are everywhere. They're the smog, right? So they're in books, they're in TV shows, they're in what we're consuming unconsciously all the time. But it's so important to look for and provide those counter narratives, those alternate ways of seeing, those alternate ways of being. And that can be everything from the texts that you have in the classroom, right? Like making sure that you have examples of even just like girl scientists or like Black girl doctors or Latino male engineers, right? Like even anything like that helps to expand a student and a child's understanding of what is possible and who does what, right? And the last point is really just a reiteration of what Harvey is saying. We need to teach our children to be good friends. Austin Channing Brown, who's an anti-racist scholar, says the goal of anti-racism is the goal of being a better human to other humans. And I think that that's just a really beautiful way of thinking about it and of thinking about the work that we're doing and the work that we're trying to prepare children to do, right? Okay. One last point that I really want to make is that we are not going to fix everything tomorrow. We're not going to fix everything in a year. My vision, the thing that keeps me going, is that we are just constantly improving, and then we are urgent about it, we are focused, and we are doing our best to individually grow, to as a community grow, to as a country grow, to as a world. I wrote an article, which I didn't link, but maybe if you're interested, I can share it with you. It's about sustainable anti-racism practice. And I talk about a circle, like a cycle. So first, there's this commitment to anti-racism. I'm going to do this work, okay? The second step is education. So we're learning about systems of oppression. We're learning about how to be an anti-racist. We're learning how to do this work. Step 3 is doing the work, right? And step 4 is stepping back and reflecting. What went well? What didn't? What do I understand? What do I not understand? And then we start over at the top. We recommit, we learn more, we practice more, we reflect again. What went well, what didn't? We do it again. And it is a lifelong, constant cycle. And sometimes these cycles are a day, and sometimes these cycles are months. Everyone is on their journey, but I do think that the idea of a circle is really, really important, because rest is important, reflection is important, but continuing to learn and getting back on the horse is also the most important thing that we can do, particularly with the responsibility that we have to our kids. So that's the end of my talk. I do hope it was helpful. I hope that you learned something. I hope that it got some thoughts flying in your head. If you have thoughts, please write them down, save them. And then on November 14th, I will be available for a live Q&A. It is my birthday, so I'm very excited to talk about these things on my birthday. But that'll happen November 14th. I also, on the next slide, have resources. Move my little head again. These resources I found to be super helpful, and I referenced them a lot, particularly Beverly Tatum's TED Talk. I talked about Jennifer Harvey. I found these to be really, really educational. I'm going to make sure that you have access to these. I'm going to make sure to talk to the coordinator so you can see the resources. But I think that these are all really helpful when we're thinking about what we can do and what work people have already done. Experts, including educators and researchers, we're in this together. And so there's lots that we can learn from each other. That's it. So thank you so much. And I look forward to talking with you on November 14th. All right, take care, be well.